you so much for joining me today. It's More Linguistics. Today we will be talking a little bit about language and the brain, also known as neurolinguistics. This is just an introduction, but today we'll go over the different parts of the brain and how they help us both produce and understand language. So if that's interesting to you, then stick around. Let's get straight to it. So as I said, today we're talking about language and the how do our brains, what is so special about the human brain that allows us to produce and understand language? So there are a little bit of differences between neurolinguistics and psycholinguistics. Neurolinguistics is the study of the neuro and electrochemical basis of language development and use. So what is physically going on inside the brain such that we can use language. Psycholinguistics is the study of the acquisition, storage, comprehension, and production of language. So it's not looking as much at things like those neural signals, the electrochemical signals, the actual brain chemistry that allows us to produce language is looking at the psychological effects of language. Let's talk briefly about the anatomy of the brain. There are different parts of the brain, and each of them contribute to language production in different ways. So, the brain is made of two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, and these hemispheres are split into 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, which is of course in the front part of the brain, the parietal lobe, which is located kind of in the middle part of the brain, the temporal lobe, which is located on either side of the brain, and the occipital lobe, which is in the back of the brain. So there are 2 hemispheres with 1, 2, 3, 4 different lobes. As I said, each lobe is in charge of something different, it has different features and functions, but each contribute in some way to language use. So the frontal lobe is in the front part of the brain, and it contributes to language production. It is our primary motor cortex, so controls our motor functions, which includes things not just like walking, grabbing something, running up the stairs, but also the motor functions that go into language production, like moving your lips, your tongue, and other muscles along the vocal tract. It's also responsible for higher level thinking, which is of course very important for language production. The parietal lobe is located in the middle of the brain, right above the temporal lobe, And its functions are the integration of sensory information and processing of vision and space around you. So this is very important, especially for signed languages where the information is received visually, as this is responsible for the processing of vision and space, but also integrates other sensory information. And of course, sight has an important role in spoken languages as well. You may know that it's more difficult to understand someone when you cannot see their mouth moving. Think about talking to someone over the phone, or maybe when there's lag in a video call and their words do not align with their mouth movements and may be more difficult to understand what they're saying. So while vision has a smaller role to play in the processing of spoken languages, it certainly doesn't have no role to play. The occipital lobe is located in the back of the brain. And this is our primary visual cortex and is responsible for the integration of visual stimuli. So once again, going back, very important for the understanding of signed languages especially, but certainly has a role to play in the understanding of spoken languages as well. And then the temporal lobe is located on either side of the brain, underneath the parietal lobe. This is our primary auditory cortex and responsible for the processing of auditory stimuli. So of course, very important for spoken languages. So this is the primary cortex that integrates auditory stimuli, so words as well as other sounds. What's actually very interesting is that for deaf individuals who can't hear, especially profoundly deaf individuals who cannot hear any sound, the temporal lobe becomes repurposed almost as an additional cortex for visual stimuli. So some of the functions that the temporal lobe would perform in hearing individuals becomes repurposed or reassigned to different senses in deaf individuals. Now, the brain is lateralized. What this means is the brain is divided into two hemispheres, and each hemisphere is responsible for different cognitive functions. This is called lateralization. For most people, language processing happens in the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere of your brain is primarily responsible for language processing. The left hemisphere of the brain contains several really important parts of the brain for language processing, including the primary motor cortex, which allows us to perform the motor functions necessary to speak or sign, the primary somatosensory cortex, the primary visual cortex, the primary auditory area, as well as Wernicke's area and Broca's area, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute. But some of the most important areas for language processing, language production, and language integration are located on the left hemisphere of the human brain. So the cortex is a thick membrane that covers the brain, and several have specialized functions relating to language. For example, the motor cortex sends signals to your muscles, including those of your face, jaw, and tongue, which allows you to produce language. Of course, sends signals to the rest of your body for other motor functions, or to your hands for signed languages. The auditory cortex receives and identifies auditory signals. Very important if you speak a language that relies on sound to be understood. And the visual cortex receives and interprets visual stimuli, of course essential for those who use signed languages, but also plays an important function in the ease of understanding for spoken languages as well. And of course, when it comes to the visual cortex and the processing of visual stimuli, not only is seeing mouth movements important for processing of language, but things like facial expression, body language, etc. play a large role when it comes to language and meaning. Now, another important area of the brain is called Broca's area. It is located right here at the base of the motor cortex. It is primarily involved in the production of language. Broca's area is responsible for the organization of articulatory patterns of language, inflectional morphemes, which we've talked about in the morphology video, things like function words, so not contentful words, but things like articles, prepositions, determiners in English, sentence structure, and pronouns. So Broca's area is involved in the production of language, and especially things that are not content rich, but that more deep grammatical function of language. It is located right here. In contrast, Wernicke's area is located near the back section of the auditory cortex, right here. And it is primarily involved in language perception and comprehension. It is responsible for the comprehension of words and sentences, so receiving that auditory or visual stimuli and then comprehending it, and also selection of words from the mental lexicon. We talked about the mental lexicon in the last video and also in our morphology and semantics video. But your mental lexicon is the mental representation of all of the words you know. So Wernicke's area is what allows us to find that word in our huge mental lexicon and select the appropriate word for the sentence or utterance we are planning to produce. How do we know this? How do we know that these two little areas in the brain are responsible for such huge parts of language production and comprehension? Well, the main way we know this is by studying cases of language impairment, particularly due to head injury, stroke, etc. So language impairment that comes from some sort of injury to the brain. So studies of patients whose corpus callosum, that is the connecting nerve fibers between the two hemispheres of the brain. So for patients where the connection between the two hemispheres of the brain has been severed, or who have had one hemisphere removed for one reason or another, we've studied those patients and examined their language production. And also through the use of technology, so things like hemodynamic neuroimaging, MRIs, direct brain recording and stimulation, etc. So either through examining instances of people who have had some sort of trauma to the brain, or by using technology to examine brain activity in either healthy or injured brains. One of the ways that we have discovered things like Broca's area and Wernicke's area is through the study of something called aphasia. Aphasia is an inability to perceive, process, or produce language because of physical damage to the brain. This is found in very few people suffering from damage to the right hemisphere of the brain. Why do we think that may be? Dora the Explorer moment. Because language production is primarily focused in the left hemisphere of the brain. And this is another way that we've learned that language production and comprehension is primarily found in the left hemisphere of the brain, because those with injury to the right side of their brains do not usually suffer from aphasia. So aphasia is usually the result of a stroke or an accident that causes some sort of damage, primarily to the left hemisphere of the brain, that creates an inability to perceive, process, or produce language. And there are several different types of aphasia. One is called Broca's aphasia, which, as you may expect, is the result of damage to the Broca's area and typically causes difficulties in speech production. Those with Broca's aphasia typically speak or sign haltingly. They do not produce fluid speech. There are lots of pauses, lots of ums and uhs in between each of their words. For English speakers, those with Broca's aphasia typically have problems with function words and inflectional suffixes. So things like saying he walks instead of he walk. And for ASL users, their language typically contains no inflection or classifiers if an ASL user also suffers from Broca's aphasia. Now note that Broca's aphasics do not have a problem understanding the speech of others unless meaning is determined by syntactic order. So what that means is that if someone suffers from Broca's aphasia, they can understand speech, but have difficulty producing speech, but they do have difficulty understanding speech where word order is essential for understanding. So things like I saw him versus he saw me, or even something that does not have any case like the man saw the dog versus the dog saw the man, may be more difficult for someone with Broca's aphasia to understand. Contrast this then with Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia is the result of damage to the Wernicke's area, which is responsible for speech comprehension. And this is a disorder that results in difficulties understanding the speech of others. They may also have trouble interpreting words from their mental lexicon, and so speech is often semantically incoherent, otherwise known as word salad. They often use circumlocutions, which is a roundabout description, because they're having difficulty retrieving a specific word from their mental lexicon. They may try and describe that word or talk around that word or use circumlocutions to try and get to that word that they are having difficulty retrieving from their mental lexicon. So, for instance, if you are talking with someone who has Wernicke's aphasia and you ask them a question, the answer they give you may be somewhat or completely unrelated to your question because it is a disorder that results in difficulties understanding the speech of others. So we can contrast Broca's aphasia, in which aphasics can understand the speech of others but have difficulty producing fluid sounding speech. It may still be understandable, but it is missing those key features that would make it sound completely fluent or native. Whereas those with Wernicke's aphasia speak very fluidly or very rapidly, but the actual content of their speech is very difficult to understand because of the way they're talking around things. They're not staying on a specific topic, things of that nature. So through the study of things like aphasia, through injuries to the brain, through stroke or accident or some other brain trauma, we've come to know a lot about how the brain contributes to language production and comprehension. And so those are just some of the ways in some parts of the brain that play a really, really crucial role in language production, language comprehension, language integration. So this was a little bit of a shorter video, but just wanted to introduce you to some of those topics in neurolinguistics. I hope you enjoyed. If there are other topics in linguistics you would like me to speak about, please let me know in the comments. I have some plans for future videos, but I'm always welcome to suggestions. But for now, I will see you in the next video, and good night.